Diálogos con México, Dialogue with Mexico, where we have an opportunity to hear from leading Mexican intellectuals, journalists, policymakers about the pressing issues of the day in Mexico. This is a particularly important session because we are honored to co-host today's talk with Michael Shifter and the president of the Inter-American Dialogue, who will provide us some commentary after Denise's remarks. And most importantly, because we're hosting one of the luminaries of Mexican journalism and political thought, Dr. Denise Dresser. I want to introduce her in just a minute, but before I do, I want to just acknowledge a few people here. I think I saw Diana Negropontes here today, a member of our advisory board at the Mexico Institute from the Brookings Institution, and we're always delighted to have her with us and her involvement in our work. I also see there are a number of distinguished journalists from the Mexican Press Corps with us, so welcome to you all as well. We have a number of people joining us via the web, and so we're delighted to have them here as well. I know that, I believe that they're broadcasting this, viewing this at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City, because they contacted me last week about this, so hopefully there's some folks there. I don't think that'll change anything you have to say, but anyway, we want to make sure and welcome them and anyone else. I'll give you time to edit your remarks, Denise. As I say, we're delighted to have Denise Dresser with us today. This is the latest in a series of conferences she's held here in Washington. She was at the National Defense University this morning. And each time she's here, the interest she generates in Washington and even back in Mexico is enormous. And we're delighted that she's chosen to join us today. Last year, she was here just after, I believe, she was awarded the prestigious National Journalism Award for a column she published in the Proceso magazine entitled An Open Letter to Carlos Slim. And I invite you to look for that. I think it's a fascinating piece. She writes a regular political column for Proceso and the Reforma newspaper and has published numerous opinion pieces in many of top U.S. and Canadian newspapers like the LA Times, New York Times, Toronto's Globe and Mail. She's also a professor of political science at the ITAM, the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México. She's an astute advisor of Mexico's political and economic reality and does the seemingly impossible in the complex and polarized world of Mexican politics by being honest, principled, a fierce advocate for democracy and a competitive marketplace without aligning herself to a particular political party or movement. Let me read just a couple of lines from a recent column on the decision by the PAN and PRD parties to reject a political alliance in the state of Mexico, where a recent plebiscite overwhelmingly supported such an alliance, presumably as a way to upend the PRI's 80 years of unbroken rule in the state of Mexico. I'm just going to quote, translated this into English, and I've added a little bit just so it made a little sense, but here are a couple of those lines. By fighting amongst themselves, the PRD's tribes have succeeded in feeding the monster that is devouring them. By naming their candidate before the alliance could be worked out, the PAN has given vitamins to the PRI candidate, Avila, and his benefactors. By rejecting an alliance, the PRD and PAN are voluntarily diminishing themselves while helping grow the real enemy. These are not atypical words for Denise, honest, forthright, even biting at times. Hold on to your hats, folks. Hold on to your armrests. This should be fun. Denise?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So, Mexican President Felipe Calderón finally got what he wanted. the resignation of U.S. Ambassador Carlos Pascual. He shot the messenger for delivering bad news through confidential cables leaked by WikiLeaks because of the negative assessments they contained on the war on drugs he unleashed 4 years ago. The revelations also bothered the Mexican army for pointing out that frequently it doesn't act on intelligence provided by the United States and shows a strong aversion to risk. Moreover, the ambassador's candid views described a dysfunctional situation wherein Mexican security agencies spend more time undermining each other than they do fighting organized crime. Essentially, Carlos Pascual lost his job for doing it well, for telling the truth, for describing a dire situation on the ground that Felipe Calderón doesn't want to face and the Mexican government would prefer to ignore. But the stubborn truth revealed by the US diplomat emerges day after day, despite the number of top drug pins arrested, the number of weapons discovered, the amount of cocaine seized. Mexico is not winning the war against drug trafficking and organized crime, nothing more and nothing less. The forced resignation of the American official cannot hide the 34,000 dead, and if we continue at this pace, it will be 50,000 by the end of the sexenio. The growing onslaught of executions, the growing percentage of Mexican people addicted to drugs, the rise in the number of kidnappings, the intransigence of impunity. Meanwhile, the official line is that violence is an inevitable consequence of taking on the cartels, creating the ironic situation that my colleague and friend Jesus Silva Herzog Marquez has pointed out, wherein deaths are presented as political trophies. Mexicans are told that in reality, it's only rival gangs fighting to the death when executions transcend the realm of drug trafficking. And Mexicans are exhorted by their government to denounce criminals in a country where 98.5% of crimes investigated are never resolved. So it's no wonder that in a recent Mitofsky poll, 59% of Mexicans believe that the government is losing the war it declared, while only 23% support the current course. Now, it's true, Felipe Calderón deserves recognition for placing the need to confront organized crime as a central theme of the country's national security strategy. The federal government, yes, should also be commended for pushing an agenda of institutional strengthening in the security area. Although it's not clear that it will offer results in the short term, it may serve as a platform for future governments. However, as Eduardo Guerrero has argued in his seminal work on this topic, the Calderón government failed in two crucial areas: the diagnosis of the problem and the method to combat it. The government believed wrongly that criminal organizations would not have the capacity to resist its onslaught. Worse yet, the government believed that as it prepared to begin the war in 2007, that it organizationally, structurally, in terms of resources, was prepared for that tactic. These errors of calculus have had enormous costs for the country in terms of human lives, and the uncontrollable increase in violence in various parts of the country has propitiated that the official strategy of the government revert against itself. As Sun Tzu wrote in The Art of War, all wars entail deception, and Mexico has been its latest victim. The Mexican government simply has not been honest enough about the enormity of the challenges it faces, the counterproductive measures it has taken, the level of US support it has requested, the degree of US involvement it has demanded, the amount of US collaboration it has sought behind closed doors. And therein the contradictions, the evasions, the lack of transparency regarding the terms in which this war is being conducted. Everyone on the Calderón team demands that the United States devote more attention, more resources, more importance to the president's war, but publicly deny doing so when evidence of that heightened US presence in Mexico becomes public. So we've seen as a result of this how in recent weeks the Calderón administration has twisted itself into a pretzel trying to explain why on the one hand it got the US ambassador fired and why on the other it authorized American drone planes to fly over Mexican territory for intelligence gathering purposes. So at the same time that Calderón insists that the US assume its bilateral responsibilities, he cuts off the ambassador's head for revealing the strategic mistakes that the government has made in the war it wants help fighting. Now, Calderón's contradictory stances are rooted in the reflexive habit of a Mexican political class trained to gain points by kicking the United States. Calderón has sought refuge, traditional refuge, behind the folds of the Mexican flag, under the umbrella of Mexican patriotism, behind the diatribes voiced in the name of sovereignty under siege. The incongruity in this case, however, is that Calderón accuses the US of intervention after he has assiduously sought it out. He criticizes the US of meddling after that meddling has been promoted by the Mexican government itself. Ambassador Pascual was accused of behaving like a proconsul after Mexican authorities in Ciudad Juárez and elsewhere, due to incompetence or irresponsibility, assigned him that role. In an interview with the Washington Post, Calderón lambasted the ambassador for his ignorance after Pascual sent cables with correct, realistic, mainstream, and incontrovertible diagnoses. They're painful to read, but difficult to contradict. And more than killing the messenger, I think Felipe Calderón and others in his government need to reflect on the messages he sent. They contain everything that should lead the Mexican president to rethink the war and the terms in which he is waging it. The cable should lead Calderón to rectify a strategy that up to now has increased violence without decreasing drug trafficking. The information that Ambassador Pascual conveyed should force Mexico's executive to redefine as well the country's relationship with the United States in a much more honest fashion. And the success of the war needs to be measured by the reduction of executions. Because if all of this doesn't happen, it won't matter if Felipe Calderón was able to force the US ambassador out of the country or whether he obtained short-term political gains for doing so. In a few weeks, when the ugly American has packed his bags, Ciudad Juárez will still be the most dangerous city in the country and in the world. The homicide rate will continue to grow in an alarming way. Public security agencies in Mexico will remain incapable of preventing, detecting, or sanctioning the vast majority of violent events that have placed the country under siege. The Mexican government will continue to request US aid in a surreptitious fashion and deny the fact when it becomes public. I think the message is clear, at least for me. If we don't change this war, conceived as it has been, executed as it has been, explained badly as it has been, it will end us. And it's not necessary to read Carlos Pascual's leaked cables to understand that. I think at this point, Felipe Calderón probably only has two choices, and if you think that there are more, I'd be happy to explore them in the Q&A. He has only dos sopas, de dos sopas, as we say in Mexico. Either you legalize or you Colombianize. The president has reiterated that he is willing to debate the legalization option, but is vehemently against it. He argues that the costs would be higher than the benefits and is not willing to consider an option that an increasing number of experts and ex-presidents are advocating, faced with the historic and proven failure of the same alternatives that we've been following in other latitudes. So Mexico can continue to insist on the same course with the same failed results, or it can attempt to reproduce the Colombian model. As Michael Shifter has argued in his article, A Decade of Plan Colombia, security conditions there have improved substantially over the past decade. Now, for that to occur in Mexico, the government would have to acknowledge what it has not been willing to acknowledge so far in Mexico. First, that the fundamental efficacy of the Mexican state is in jeopardy, that without more significant US support, including more US military and intelligence personnel on the ground, the deterioration of the security situation will continue to take place, that Calderón in this scenario would be forced to knock on Washington's door just after he has forced the resignation of Carlos Pascual, and at a time when the last thing Barack Obama needs or wants is involvement in another conflict, that if Mexico treads down the Colombian path, the costs in terms of human rights violations will be high, that the Colombian approach would also entail not just military combat, but a broad anti-corruption campaign aimed at the courts and the municipal presidencies and the governorships, something the administration in Mexico has been unwilling to consider up to now, that Calderón would have to convince the Mexican population of the need to change tax at a time when the government's credibility on the security issue is at an all-time low. I think this is the terrible dilemma that my country faces and needs to come to terms with. And who wins in this scenario in which Felipe Calderón has staked his political fortunes on a war that the public believes he is losing? The PRI. All you have to do is to see the expressions on the faces of prominent members of the party. All you have to do is bear witness to their shared smiles, their self-satisfied demeanor, their enthusiastic embraces in public events. They know they are on their way back. They know that poll after poll puts them in first place in the presidential race in 2012. The PRI reemerges, the PRI resurrects itself, the PRI rebounds. The key beneficiary of an incompetent National Action Party and a self-destructive left. The PRI is close to regaining control of Los Pinos, the presidential residence, only after 2 sexenios of being forced out of there. And for many Mexicans, and for some analysts in the United States, this possibility is not a cause for insomnia or even concern. They speak of the return of the PRI as if it were a symptom of democratic normalcy, an indicator of positive alternancia, a sign of the modernization that Mexico has achieved and that they say it would be impossible to revert. The country isn't the same as it was in 1988, they say. The PRI couldn't govern in the authoritarian fashion it used to, they argue. The PRI would be forced to implement the reforms it has rejected up to now, even though, I underscore, it has, in tandem with the Green Party, today a majority in Congress. I wish those people who say these things were right. I wish that those who sleep easily faced with the prospect of Enrique Peña Nieto in the presidency, Manlio Fabio Beltrones in the Ministry of Gobernación, Emilio Gamboa in the presidency of the party, and Beatriz Paredes in any cabinet position. I wish that those who sleep easy with those prospects were right. I wish it were true that a new era of PRI presidencies were a sign of healthy rotation and not regrettable regression. I wish it were true that the country had changed enough to prevent the resurgence of the worst practices of the past. But any serious, in-depth analysis of the PRI today contradicts that prediction, based more on wishful thinking than on actual reality. As one of Tom Friedman's columns so accurately encapsulated, 3 groups coexist in Mexico today: the narcos, the nos, and the naftas. The drug traffickers, the beneficiaries of the status quo, and social groups, basically middle-class Mexicans who aspire to modernization and progress. Today, by definition, the PRI is the party of the no. The party that opposes necessary reforms due to the rent-seeking crony capitalist interests it protects, the party that rejects citizen candidacies due to the system of elite rotation it created and defends, the party that resists the modernization of corporatist unions because they constitute its key bases of support, the party that doesn't want to touch monopolies, well, because it was responsible for their construction, The PRI and its bases are the no's because they constitute the main opposition to any change that would entail opening, privatizing, confronting, changing the system that the priistas conceived and still live by. And to those who would question this position, and please feel free to do so in the Q&A, I would urge you to read the atavistic speeches of Beatriz Paredes on the oil industry, to examine the puerile and ill-informed opposition of Enrique Peña Nieto to legislative re-election, to reflect on the questionable business interests that Manlio Fabio Beltrones defended when he shot down reforms to the competition law several months ago, to take into account the alliance that Elvester Gordillo has established with the young dinosaur in the state of Mexico in order to assure that he win the presidential race. There it is. The clientelist PRI, the corporatist PRI, the PRI built on the practice of government as distribution of the spoils. Meanwhile, Beatriz Paredes and others crisscross the country, exhorting Mexicans to give thanks to the PRI, darle gracias al PRI. Thanks to the PRI, Mexico has had political stability for so many years, she proclaims. Thanks to the PRI, there isn't further political polarization, she says. Thanks to the PRI, the country hasn't fallen even deeper into the hole that the PAN has spent the past 10 years digging, she hails. Yet I would argue that there are other lists of PRI accomplishments that it is important to recount as the party stands poised to regain the presidency. Mexico drags behind itself a legacy that should not provide motive for thanks or applause. Mexico is saddled with an inheritance that the PRI distances itself from rhetorically, but is responsible for. Thanks to the PRI, drug traffickers infiltrated the Mexican state in the 1980s. Business began to boom, and it did so with political protection, with the complicity of the federal judicial police, with the collusion of governors like Mario Villanueva and other PRI leaders of narco-municipalities in border states. Throughout the years, the political structure of the PRI provided a shell for organized crime that entrenched itself not despite the government, but in many ways, thanks to it. And when the panistas reached the presidency, they faced state authorities that had become accomplices, police ranks that had been infiltrated, judges that had become corrupt. And undoubtedly, both the Fox and Calderon administrations have not been able to deal with those challenges in the most effective way. The former due to omission, the latter due to the lack of understanding as to how profound the problem was. But what is undeniable is that the PAN is not responsible for the problem. The PAN inherited it and arguably made it worse. Today, the PRI blames the PAN for the mess it left behind. Thanks to the PRI, impunity has become a way of life in Mexico, a necessary condition for the functioning of the political system, una condición necesaria. As ex-President Miguel de la Madrid acknowledged to Carmen Aristegui in an interview for which she won the National Journalism Award. The PRI inaugurated a power-sharing system based on the political protection of its members, independently of the students they assassinated, the state coffers they plundered, the scandals they were involved in, the economic debacles, 82, 88, 94, they created. So it's no surprise that Felipe Calderón allegedly said in a recent event, Dios quiera y no regresen a la presidencia. Let's hope that God doesn't let them return to the presidency. But if that happens, both he and his predecessor will have been responsible for believing that it was enough to kick the PRI out of Los Pinos without substantially modifying, exposing, or confronting its modus operandi. The great mistake of the PAN has been trying to operate within the structure that the PRI created instead of dismantling it through substantive political and economic reform. The enormous error that the PAN has been responsible for is emulating the priistas instead of rejecting the way of life and the way of doing politics that the PRI conceived and I believe has done such damage to the country. So now that the PRI denounces the failure of the PAN in the presidency, in a certain perverse way, it's right. The apprentices are being skewered by the masters. The panistas have failed in their effort to govern as the priistas used to do. They have failed in their effort to adapt themselves to the institutions that the PRI twisted. Regrettably, the PAN has spent the past 11 years mimicking some of the PRI's worst practices instead of distancing itself from them. The PAN has not known how to intelligently take on the old regime. At times, it has seemed that PAN leaders don't even want to do so. They've copied everything that their party was conceived to combat. Anti-democratic union leaders, corrupt governors, pervasive patrimonialism, and as the polls underscore, many Mexicans believe that if the PAN keeps on governing as the PRI did, perpetuating privileges, protecting crony capitalists, creating clienteles, but doing so less effectively, why bother to vote for it? As Jorge Castañeda has said, pa priistas en el gobierno, pues mejor el PRI. Now, this outcome is also due to the dysfunctionality of the Mexican left and of a PRD that 5 years after the 2006 presidential election still doesn't know what to do with Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And that is all I'm going to say on that topic right now because it is too depressing. I'm happy to get into it in the discussion session. Meanwhile, to get to my last point, I've gone through drugs, dinosaurs. Now let's talk about Mexico's dithering. We are told that the problem over the past 11 years has been that we have a democracy that isn't able to reach accords, a political system in which parties have no incentives for collaboration. The reforms that Mexico needs don't happen due to the lack of consensus, is the common refrain. That tends to be the usual diagnosis about what is the matter with Mexico, and it inevitably leads to proposals geared towards the construction of legislative majorities, such as the resurrection of the cláusula de sobrerepresentación, that infamous clause that persisted throughout the Salinas period, whereby the winning party would automatically get extra seats in Congress in order to assure a majority. This reform is strongly favored by Enrique Peña Nieto. And there are other measures out there in the public debate geared towards creating a strong presidency. One of the types of measures that Felipe Calderón favors is, for example, a segunda vuelta in the presidential election so that the party that is voted in gets a legislative majority. Now, faced with that diagnosis and those recommendations, I'm not sure that we're centering our attention on the right problem. I believe that Mexico isn't prostrate due to the lack of agreements or the inexistence of consensus or the absence of legislative majorities. In Mexico, there already is a tacit agreement among politicians, businessmen, unions, governors, and other beneficiaries of the status quo. But it is an agreement to not change. Es un pacto para el no, a pact for the no, so that there are no deep reforms that affect historically protected interests, so that it is not possible to reduce the slices of the pie that privileged sectors devour in order to design a bigger pie for everybody. All you have to do to prove this is to examine the reforms and initiatives and laws that do get passed. Energy reform, approved by a legislative majority that did not deal with the rent-seeking practices of the Pemex union. Fiscal reform, approved by a legislative majority that did not address the numerous corporate loopholes and exemptions and instead went after the captive middle class. The tax exemption to new players in cellular telephony, approved by legislative majority, that did not seek to enhance competitiveness in the sector, but rather grant another favor to Televisa. Last year's budget, approved by legislative majority, that did not seek to redirect public spending to unleash economic growth, but rather funneled it to unaccountable state governors. In Mexico, every day, and this is my point, majorities are created in Congress, but they are majorities that manage to preserve instead of transform. Majorities created by congressmen and senators forged by interests they want to keep on protecting, including their own. Because of the veto centers they must take orders from or ingratiate themselves with, Televisa, Televisión Azteca, Carlos Slim, Cemex, because of the derechos adquiridos or acquired rights in the unions, including the derecho adquirido or acquired right that a member of the teachers' union has to sell, inherit, or trade his or her post for sexual favors, something that even El Bester Gordillo has been forced to recognize. Because of the pressure exerted by business elites that demand that the government act and reform, but they believe it's unacceptable that they act against their business interests regarding competition policy or tax policy. In Mexico, everybody demands reform, but always in somebody else's sector. En los bueyes del vecino. And moreover, when even timid reforms do take place, business elites block them through legal and political maneuvering. Mexico has become trapped by a foundational pact where we've been dragging it along since after the revolution that is very difficult to modify because those with the power to rewrite it live very well. Political parties with their assured multi-million-dollar public financing system, monopolists with their high barriers to entry and their captured regulators and their bought-off legislators, and their army of accountants to elude taxes, eso sí, siempre dentro del marco de la ley. Governors with their federal budgetary transfers and the capacity they have to spend them in a completely opaque fashion, and the National Action Party unwilling to touch those vested interests or those veto centers over the past 11 years, it has controlled the presidency, for fear that they will throw their support behind the PRI once again. And the paradox here is that those vested interests are already throwing their support behind the PRI again. I call this a system of extraction without representation. A rent-seeking pact, a pact wherein it is possible for Mexico's political and economic elites to avail themselves of the wealth of others, the wealth of citizens. And the country's elites have enriched themselves legally for decades through what economic literature calls rent-seeking. Governmental, business, union, party, rent-seeking behavior built on the basis of economic transactions that are beneficial for all of these vested interests that I have listed, but noxious for consumers and citizens. Predatory rent-seeking based on contracts doled out to family members of political officials, the control of public concessions by oligarchs disguised as national champions, the guaranteed payment of political slush to public sector unions despite their low productivity, the capacity of creatures of the state, because El Bester Gordillo and Televisa and Carlos Slim are creatures of the state, the capacity of those creatures of the state to blackmail and capture Congress, subvert democracy, and block the development of competitive markets, perpetuate the power of rent-seeking elites, and keep on squeezing citizens. Because I am an orange. Just like my fellow compatriots in Mexico, I get squeezed every day by a public or private company that charges me an excessive price or an exorbitant fee or an unjustified commission or forces me to accept expensive or bad service because I have no other choice. Whether it is Telmex or Scotiabank or Banamex or the Federal Electricity Commission or an Afore or a retirement fund or a public notary. Someone with the last name Slim or any other of the monopolists, oligopolists, and rent seekers that thrive in Mexico's economy. Every day, my fellow citizens and I become victims of a top-heavy, oligopolized economic structure in which 3 banks dominate the country's financial services, 2 companies control its open television networks. 1 company controls the country's phone network. 2 business groups control the distribution of gas. 2 companies control the cement market. 1 company controls 2/3 of the production of corn flour. 3 companies control the production of chicken and eggs. 2 companies control 80% of the milk market. 3 companies dominate the market of processed meat. 1 company controls the production of bread, and 2 companies control the distribution of medicines. These companies, with the consent or the collusion of government officials and regulators, in their sectors basically do whatever they want. They control, they collude, they abuse, they squeeze, they tear off succulent slice after succulent slice, transaction after transaction, contract after contract, fee after fee. As the Mexican Competition Commission has suggested, each Mexican family transfers 75,000 pesos annually to monopolized sectors, and the poor pay 40% more than they should for basic services like telephony. Widespread rent-seeking produces social costs, heightens economic inequalities, elevates transaction costs in an economy that, in order to be globally competitive, desperately needs to reduce them. Worst yet, entrenched rent-seeking has created a national orange grove in which 90% of the abuses committed against consumers and citizens go unpunished. And therein, the importance of restructuring and strengthening regulatory entities like the Competition Commission, of elevating the fines for anti-competitive behavior according to best global practices so that they become the equivalent of 10% of global sales and not just $7 million as they are today, of even penal sanctions for cartel-like behavior, as has been suggested by the OECD, of allowing class action lawsuits and other forms of collective rights so that the citizens and consumers can organize themselves instead of watching passively how their rights are being violated. Now, I say this in the context of what is happening in Mexico today. The Calderón administration is sitting passively by in the fight between Televisa and Teléfonos de México. A fight between monsters, a battle, I call it, between alien and predator. A confrontation between 2 misshapen creatures conceived by a crony, colluded, or weak government. A battle that should focus on innovation, on the best way to compete, on the reduction of costs and how to pass them on to consumers, has centered instead on which oligarch will keep or receive the largest slice of the pie of a television and telecommunications market valued at $35 billion, on who will receive the largest number of concessions of a public good. The fight over interconnection rates between Mr. Slim and Mr. Azcárraga, or if Mr. Slim should be allowed into the cable television business, obscures fundamental and structural themes about the bad rules that regulate the functioning of the Mexican economy. Rules that favor predators over consumers, that strengthen monsters instead of containing them, rules that permit counterproductive concentration instead of indispensable competition. Competition that the Calderón government has not tried to promote as strongly as it should have, despite the favorable rhetoric of over the past 4 years. Competition that should include measures that neither of these 2 monsters want, such as a 3rd television network, much lower interconnection rates, multi-billion-dollar fines for monopolistic practices, sanctions to those who would violate the terms of their concession, including, I would argue, the revocation of that concession. Changes that hesitant authorities have refused to adopt, modifications that a captured Congress has been reluctant to support, alternatives that courts and judges have successfully blocked, and as long as that doesn't change, the current stalemate simply illustrates the promotional phrase that accompanied the trailer of the film Alien vs. Predator: no matter who wins, we all lose. Mexicans lose. And it's not due to the lack of congressional agreements or the absence of legislative majorities. Mexicans lose due to what Santiago Levy and Michael Walton describe in their book, No Growth Without Equity, Inequality, Interest, and Competition in Mexico. Mexicans lose because of the perpetuation of an unequal pact that leads to the concentration of wealth in few hands, an inefficient pact because it inhibits accelerated economic growth, and worse yet, it is a self-sustaining pact because its beneficiaries have no incentives to alter it. Now, the question for Mexico becomes how to change those rules of the game, how to emulate what other countries with top-heavy economic structures have done with their public and private monopolies, those monopolies that strangled their economies. Well, remember when the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies dominated US markets? They could, as Carlos Slim and others in Mexico do today, behave as they wanted to. And little by little, the public began to raise its voice. The uncontainable power of the robber barons led to a progressive movement, ultimately championed by Theodore Roosevelt. The owners of the government of the United States are the capitalists, he railed. The government has become the adoptive son of the vested interests, he claimed. And then his government devoted itself to breaking them up or regulating them better. The fundamental defining challenge for Mexico is how to reproduce that liberating experience. Reform and regulate in the name of the public interest and level playing field capitalism. The Mexican government needs to send unequivocal signals about how it is going to deactivate those veto centers that are blocking economic growth and democratic consolidation. Tiene nombre y apellido. Abusive monopolists, rapacious unions, blackmailing television networks, unaccountable governors, and their allies in the government. For Mexico to do more than dither, economically speaking, important decisions that unleash economic growth, strengthen the regulatory capacity of the state, and contribute to level the playing field by enhancing competition, those decisions need to take place. And in the political realm, Mexico also needs to recognize that its dysfunctional democracy also needs to be reformed, given the lessons we've learned over the past 11 years since Vicente Fox was elected. The political and electoral system that we created in the 1990s is exhibiting fundamental flaws. What have we learned? That it was created, yes, to assure the rotation of party elites, but not to assure the representation of citizens. That it was created, yes, to promote competition among political parties, but not to force them to be accountable. As my friend and colleague Juan Pardinas argues, Mexican democracy is like a green dog. How many times have you seen a green dog? You haven't. It's too exotic. Mexican democracy is unusual insofar as it doesn't permit re-election for any political position. It prohibits independent candidacies. It does not allow referendums or plebiscites. It is mexicanísima in its absence of mechanisms for transparency and accountability. Mexican green dog democracy is exceptional in terms of its institutional design, and I'd say worse off for it. Because on the back of that green dog, riding on the back of that green dog, are the beneficiaries of the status quo, the beneficiaries of its strange breed and color. Because without re-election, there are no incentives for accountability or citizen representation or a way to weaken local cacicazgos. Without independent candidacies, there is no way of breaking the monopoly that political parties have established over public life. Without mechanisms like referendums or plebiscites, there is no way of involving the population in the definition of fundamental national issues. Without class action and other forms of collective action, there is no way of promoting public policies that the parties don't want to touch, including competition. So Mexico, what we've learned after 11 years is we have a dysfunctional democracy that we need to fix. We have a democracy that is lacking in terms of representation and accountability that it needs to change. We have a system of extraction without representation that we need to remodel. We have basically a democracy that functions very well because it functions very well for its political parties and it functions very badly for its citizens. Therein, the need to open up spaces for citizen participation beyond elections, the need to generate incentives for legislators and municipal presidents to be more accountable, something they don't need to be now, the need to give more power to voters so that they can build effective counterweights to the established veto centers, or as we call them in Mexico, los poderes fácticos, reforms that would diminish the exceptionality of Mexican democracy, force the parties to become more accountable and more representative, domesticate the green dog and place it in the litter of more normal democracies, democracias más normalitas. And why do we keep pushing for this year after year, forum after forum, conference after conference? I always say that I began writing about Carlos Slim 5 years ago, and the only thing that has changed since my first article has been his position on the Forbes list. The regulatory environment hasn't changed, the situation for consumers hasn't changed, the competitive landscape hasn't changed. And this, along with what I've described in the presentation, the news coming out of Mexico becomes progressively worse. So why do we keep on insisting? Why do we keep on pushing? Well, here I'd like to stop and quote Bertolt Brecht, who says, "And in dark times will there be song? Yes, there will be the song of the dark times." And I think that it is imperative for Mexicans from all walks of life to take up the task of doing so, of continuing to sing and demand and denounce and fight, even in dark times, because it is precisely the resignation, the complicity, the silence, the impassibility of so many that explains why a country as majestic as Mexico has been so badly governed. Our task as analysts and citizens is to hopefully hold up a mirror so that Mexico can look at itself with the honesty that it deserves. Our task is not, as Felipe Calderón has demanded, to speak well of Mexico, but rather understand that the most important intellectual obligation we have is to pay tribute to the country by criticizing its flaws, because we know and we can envision how it can be better. And finally, our task is to ask others to be part of the rescue team of a country sequestered by violent criminals and venal governors and rent-seeking monopolists and unaccountable elites. A rescue team formed by those who refuse to be spectators in the face of injustice, stupidity, or political regression. A rescue team created by those who criticize Mexico because they are tired of what poet Carlos Pellicer called the absent splendor, el esplendor ausente. Those who sing in the dark because it is the only way to illuminate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Denise. As always, you don't disappoint. You give us a lot to think about. And we are going to take a minute here to invite Michael Shifter, our co-host today, president of the Inter-American Dialogue, to offer a few thoughts and commentary. And then we'll open it up to questions to all of you. We have about 40 minutes, so I think we're in good time. Michael?
Thank you, Eric, and it's a pleasure for the dialogue to co-host this event with the Mexico Institute, the Wilson Center, and especially a pleasure to be here with Denise, who's an old friend who spent some time at the Inter-American Dialogue some years ago. I guess Eric wanted some balance on the initial presentation, so he found somebody who was inarticulate, but I'm going to try to be negative since Denise was so upbeat and positive, just to try to give the other side of this perspective. And I'm going to try to cover, I'll let others talk about dinosaurs and dithering. I'm going to focus on drugs, and we'll save the others for other people. I think I often have the sensation when I listen to interpretations, critiques of Mexico, as I've often felt about Colombia for a long time, a country that I've followed and continue to follow, which is that a lot of the critiques are very compelling, have a lot of validity, and then you listen to the other side and talk about some of the positive things that have happened, and they also make some sense. And so you try to sort of come out with where do you stand? The terrible and the positive sort of coexist. In the case of the situation in Mexico, though, it is hard looking at the data for all of the so-called successes of prosecutions and confiscation of drugs and other things that have been detailed by many. It just seems to me that the overwhelming weight of the evidence is very troubling. It seems that it's simply too strong. The drug war is too vicious, too brutal, that whatever steps and measures are being taken simply haven't been able to make a lot of progress. And the argument that somehow you need this at the beginning. A lot of violence sort of shows that things are eventually working because you're breaking up the old system, I think, has a certain time limit on it. And I think that time limit is, if it hasn't passed, it's certainly about to pass. And even some of the successes that I talked about are turned into very negative consequences in Central America, in Guatemala, where a lot of the drug cartels are being pushed across the border and are creating tremendous difficulties and deterioration in the security situation in Guatemala and other countries in Central America. I do think that what was interesting what Denise said that I think is very, very important is that there needs to be, and this took a long time in Colombia, sort of a recognition that this is a major, major problem that's going to take a long time, and it's going to take the whole country to come together because the country's on the line. And I'm not sure to what extent that point has been reached in Mexico. And there is a sort of a sense, well, we're going to take some of these measures, call out the military, and we're going to resolve this and go back to the way things were. That is, I think, isn't likely to happen. And it took Colombia 20 years or so to reach a point where they said this society is no longer viable if we keep going down this road. And so there was a kind of a mobilization of society. It requires leadership. It requires really sort of tapping into something that I think is very fundamental. Let me say that Denise talked about the two options, legalization and Colombianization on the drug war. Legalization, I think, is obviously a debate, in my view, a debate that needs to happen. I'm not sure there's really compelling evidence that necessarily is going to be the solution, but it's certainly, given what we have today, there needs to be a serious discussion along those lines about what steps can be taken in the legalization path. Colombianization, as Denise said, the security situation has improved in Colombia, but the drug trade is very serious and continues to be very serious. And there are now even the security question has reemerged as a major concern. Let me just finally say this notion of shared responsibility, which we hear a lot about today, has been something that's been around for 20 years or so. I don't think it's as new as sometimes it's characterized. The question is, what does it mean in practice? There's a Merit Initiative 1, Merit Initiative 2, but is there really a very serious attempt on this side to grapple with major issues that are directly contributing to the deterioration in Mexico? And that, I think, is something that has to be part of any kind of overall presentation about what's happening. The United States has a responsibility not simply to provide assistance and resources, technical support, intelligence, and all the things which are valuable and are worthwhile, but really not enough. And if we should have learned anything from the Colombia experience, that's what we should have learned. And yet there is this sort of, let's come up with another program, let's come up with another package. Good, I'm not against that, but it clearly, if you see, in light of the evidence in Mexico, there needs to be more fundamental rethinking of policies on this side. And drug policy, obviously, is important. The outflow of guns, money flows. How much is really being done on this side? And so there is, I think we have to. Denise is very tough on the Mexican side. I think we have to be similarly tough on this side. And I think it's really, and given what she's described, there is a responsibility, I think, to really do something beyond what's currently being done. So maybe the next talk she can give would be, what's the matter with the United States? Gridlock, guns, and come up with something else. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Michael. May I respond very quickly to a couple of things you said? When you argued that it took Colombia a long time to reach a recognition that the whole country had to come together, we're not there yet. So I think that things are going to get worse before they get better, because the security situation is still something that is being used as a political football. And that, I mean, I placed a lot of responsibility on Calderón's, I think, perhaps well-intentioned but misguided strategies. But the fact is, he has not received support from the PRI governors. And that has been a major, major factor in creating the sort of situation that we're in. And I think this is going to continue to happen up until the PRI is in its second sexenio. And then the security situation may prove to be a catalyst for a coming together or a national consensus on how to deal with the issue, but we are far from that scenario. I'm also reluctant to speak about the war as if it were exclusively a drug war, because one of the things we've learned over the past, I'd say, 2 years, is that what's going on in Mexico is not just a drug war. I mean, much of the violence that is occurring, it goes far beyond the realm of drug trafficking activities. It is related to the fact, and several people have written about this in a very provocative fashion, related to the fact that when Calderón sent in the military in combination with the federal police to carry out joint operations in places like Ciudad Juárez, those joint operation maneuvers essentially entailed a dismantling of local police forces. Local police forces that, yes, were infiltrated, corrupt, etc., but that actually provided a semblance of social peace, because they kept in place a series of rules, many of them extra-legal, which people knew how to live by. The army and the federal police come in and start to patrol the streets to act simply as a deterrent against drug traffickers. But you lose that intermediation that set the rules. And what happens? A void is created, a void of absolute lack of authority, or it's unclear who has the authority. And what happens? People in Mexico start to arm themselves. And it's not just drug traffickers. It is vendedores ambulantes and small landowners and flower sellers. People arm themselves in order to protect their markets. And it's not just the market for drugs. It is the market for anything that, in the absence of state authority or in the crumbling of the authority of the state in places like Ciudad Juárez and elsewhere, it becomes a free-for-all that is leading to the increase in violence, the incredible rise in the homicide rate that is not necessarily drug-related. And therein my emphasis on how the war that we're carrying out has to really be a war about establishing security and creating, for the first time in the country's history, a rule of law. I mean, people in Mexico refer to el Estado de Derecho como si existiera, as if it existed. When I would urge you all to see Presunto Culpable, the documentary about the Mexican judicial system, so that you know exactly what sort of context we're living in. I think that's the real war that Mexico needs to win. Drug trafficking is simply symptomatic of a deeper, more structural problem that has to do with the absence of an effective rule of law. And I didn't speak much about joint responsibility on the part of the U.S., but I have a lot to say about that. Because
I'm surprised.
No, we are living in this completely contradictory scenario whereby in the United States there's no war on drugs. I think that the U.S. has given up on fighting the war on drugs domestically. I mean, all you have to do is have you ever seen The Wire, that extraordinary television series about the war on drugs in Baltimore? Alessandra Stanley, the critic, the television critic for the New York Times, once said that there is television and then there is The Wire, in one of Obama's favorite television shows. Anyway, the whole point of The Wire, in the final episode, Detective McNulty, who has been involved in this terrible, violent, and ultimately futile war against drug traffickers in Baltimore, glances down from a hill at his devastated city and realizes that his efforts have been for naught. And he says, "It is what it is." And what's happening in the US is that you're starting to see a mentality of it is what it is, and people beginning to adopt much more of a public health approach to the drug issue and the decriminalization of drugs and the push towards the legalization of marijuana in, 13 or 14 states. And Calderón was right when he came here and said, you are pushing me to fight a war that you are unwilling to fight in the same terms in your own territory, and you are pushing me to use scarce resources and the military and all of the few things we are capable of, while at the same time you are allowing people to consume marijuana for recreational and medical purposes, and you're treading down that path. So I'd say there is a fundamental contradiction in the way in which we are dealing with these issues on both sides of the border. And then the second thing is, when Hillary Clinton went to Mexico, I guess last year, there was a dinner with her and about 15 women that I attended. And the first thing I asked her was whether the Obama administration was going to be willing to use its political capital to resurrect the ban on assault weapons. And she, without hesitation whatsoever, said no, absolutely no, not, of course not. Congress will not support us. The president is not going to basically lift a finger. If there's no control over weapons in the United States, how many of them flow across the border on a daily basis? According to the Brookings Institution, I think it's 2,000 a day. I mean, there's a key source to the problem that Mexico is facing, and much of it has to do with the access to weapons. When I said Mexicans are arming themselves, and it's not just drug traffickers, where are they getting those weapons from? From drug fairs all over Arizona and other border areas. So I think unless that changes in the United States, fighting this war is attempting to harness an earthquake or a typhoon. We simply don't have the resources, the manpower, the capacity to wage this war in the fashion in which the U.S. has requested that we fight it.
Thank you.
Another question?
Yeah, raise your hand. We have a couple folks here. There's Sarah, gentleman here in the middle.
Yep.
Please identify yourselves and keep your questions short.
Hi, Ben Bodner from the Rendon Group. I guess this is just both to Denise and Michael. Last week there was on the program at NPR, they had two sides of public education and prisons, in terms of how prisons were 6 times using money in the U.S. budget compared to education. A lot of this had to do with small-time drug use, and I guess there's a political inability right now with the U.S., and I just wanted to know, like, if you guys could more comment on that, I guess, in the sense that, yes, the U.S. needs to do more, and it needs to acknowledge that Mexico is a very necessary partner, whether it be in trade with NAFTA, but I just see, like, right now there's a political lack of will, and it's not on the top of priority for either the administration or Republican opponents.
Michael, I'm going to give that to you.
No, all I can say is that I share that, unfortunately, that I don't see a lot of political momentum or anything to change that. And I certainly don't think that those kinds of issues are in the political class's mind are connected to Mexico. It's really fundamentally a domestic issue, and the foreign policy implications and the effect and consequences in Mexico are not really factored in, as far as I can tell. That's not part of the debate. It should be part of the debate because it's connected, but I don't think so. And I don't see that situation that you described changing anytime soon, unfortunately.
We had one more question there, and then we had a question over here from Jesus.
Hello, my name is Edgar Chavez. I'm a graduate student at SAIS, Johns Hopkins here. I would like to get your opinion in terms of generational change in Mexico, because we've seen recently Nexus published the results of a poll that characterizes Mexicans as increasingly liberals, but at the same time wild liberals. And I can see this trend of the younger generations that didn't grow up during the time of the regime, and which are becoming increasingly open to the outside world, to new ideas, but at the same time that live in the lack of order, the lack of direction that the country has taken has made us more distrustful of each other, not only of the state, but each other, and has caused a withdrawal from the public debate, from the public scene. So I would like to get your perspective in terms of political culture, and especially in terms of the new generations and the implications for the future of the country.
I feel, first of all, a caveat, I feel quite uncomfortable making political culture arguments to explain anything. I mean, I was trained at Princeton to use culture as an explanatory variable only when everything else has failed. But I will respond to your question. What are some of the worrying trends about Mexican political culture? I always say that one of the worst legacies of 71 years of authoritarian rule was to leave a country of people who don't know what their rights are. They don't know how to defend them. They don't know how to fight for them. They don't know the basic rights or responsibilities of citizenship. They were not educated to be citizens. So they may be liberal, and Marcelo Ebrard, the mayor of Mexico City, has understood this quite well, and therefore the turn towards liberal, progressive policies in Mexico City, where there is a large base of support for precisely those policies. But the disturbing trend I see is this apathy, this delinking from public life, this mistrust. And it's leading to what I have said, and I think I referred to this 2 years ago when I was here, what I call the Putinization of Mexico, where democracy is viewed as anarchy, as chaos. It's the same as Russia under Yeltsin, and then people begin to experience this nostalgia for an era of clarity, of rules, of order, of a firm hand. I mean, in every conversation I hear or I'm a part of, and I mean, I'm not of your generation, well, not that much difference, but I am a university professor, so I am constantly in touch with people who are between 18 and 22. And even there, among my most liberal students, I will frequently hear someone who says, pues que regrese el PRI porque por lo menos esto no pasaba con ellos. Well, the PRI should come back because at the very least, this sort of chaos didn't happen with them. And I think the PRI is gambling on that prospect, on the fact that it's going to have this base of young people who did not grow up under authoritarian rule. And the PRI will say, well, it wasn't authoritarian, it was democracia a la PRI. I think we need to be honest, it was authoritarian. People who didn't grow up under that sort of rule don't know what it was about. And they see Enrique Peña Nieto, they see him every night on TV, and he's, according to some, handsome and young, and he has a pretty wife who's a telenovela actress, starlet, and he doesn't look like the vintage dinosaurs of the past. And faced with few other alternatives, and I hope someone will ask me a question about the Mexican left, faced with the collapse of the Mexican left and the track record of the National Action Party, people are flocking to the PRI. I mean, in the absence of social ties, in the absence of well-functioning institutions, in the absence of what Francis Fukuyama calls trust, in the absence of a civic culture, Mexicans seek a providential figure who can save them from themselves. Un Cid campeador. Every 6 years, who will save us? I mean, what Mexicans yelled to Vicente Fox the night he was elected, when he was standing at the Ángel de la Independencia, no nos falles, Vicente, don't fail us. And they were surprised when that happened. Well, there's a reason why Mexican presidents keep failing in terms of popular expectations. I mean, one of the components has to do with institutional design, as I referred to. Another has to do with the country's oligopolized economic structure. And another thing has to do with the absence of effective citizenry. I mean, good governments are made by effective citizens. And when you don't have those who are at the top have no incentive whatsoever to respond to those who are at the bottom. I gave a talk at the National Defense University this morning, and on the drive back, I was saying to the person who brought me that one of the things Barack Obama said during his campaign was, power never concedes. Power never concedes without a good fight from below. Well, power in Mexico is not going to make concessions. I mean, why would you? To be a Mexican politician today is to be in the best situation on the planet. Cartloads of public money and zero accountability. So where's the incentive for change going to come from? From the only place I think it can. I'm not sure that it will, but where can it come from? From people like you. And I hope you will return and lead what I have just suggested that you do.
Okay, Jesus Esquivel from Proceso Magazine had a question right there, Dana.
Denise, I will ask you about the que regrese el PRI and the new leadership of the party. I understand that Moreira is having like breakfasts every week with some columnistas and journalists that are used to work for the PRI.
Not with me.
I know. No one from Proceso has been invited to those breakfasts. But anyway, he's talking about the solution for the narcoviolencia and the Mexican society tired of this situation that everybody's killing each other. And he's talking about negotiations with the narcos. Right. So I just wonder what you can say about it.
I think it's a fantasy. My fear is that the Mexican population will buy it. Why is it a fantasy? Because, yes, I mean, the PRI in the past pacted. We all know that. The Salinas administration pacted in the 1980s. And the pacts entailed, you do your business, you control your markets, you don't kill civilians. That pact was upended by Felipe Calderón's war and probably by infighting within the cartels even prior to Felipe Calderón's arrival to the presidency. And now Mexicans, tired of the violence, tired of the executions, concerned that the country is spinning out of control, believe that a return to those pacts is necessary. I don't think it's even possible, because the nature of the business has changed. I mean, the nature of the business has changed, and also the composition of the cartels has changed. Yes, in the 1980s, there were 3 or 4 big cartels that you could actually pact with. Now, and in the past, Mexico was just a place where drugs ran through. Now there's an active addiction problem. Now there are local markets that are being fought over. And now, because Calderón has decapitated some of the key cartels, he has produced a situation, a counterproductive situation, as Eduardo Guerrero has argued. It's like stepping on mercury. It's this effect of atomizing groups that were large and controlled by one person and creating 20 small splinter groups. So in that sort of situation, it's very hard to reach the sort of pacts that the priistas are suggesting they can assure for the country, let alone the ethical and moral dilemmas of a government sitting down to negotiate with drug traffickers. I mean, I think many of the country's problems stem from the fact that we've never had an effective rule of law. I mean, how are we going to transform that particular situation or foundational problem if the government is willing to pact with criminals? So I'm very much against what Moreira is suggesting. And I know that many people here and elsewhere in Mexico say, oh, Denise, ¿por qué le tiene tanta aversión al PRI? Why is she so averse to the PRI? Well, as I was writing out the section on the dinosaurs for this presentation, I started to reminisce on everything that I remember from that period in time. And I only wrote a couple of paragraphs, but I could have written a whole book on the fact that, yes, the PRI provided stability, and yes, it was probably less repressive than its Latin American counterparts, and yes, there was, there were elections, even if they were a sham, and yes, the PRI created institutions, but it also, it completely twisted the functioning and the objective of those institutions. And many of the problems that we now face as a society, as a country, stem from the legacies that we are carrying from our priista past. I'd say the most important of those being corporatism, clientelism, and impunity, that were, without a doubt, creations of the PRI, necessary conditions for the functioning of Mexico's particular political economy. And those conditions have not changed under democratic rule, because we focused on the electoral transition. We focused on how we could get other parties into the pact, not how we were going to rewrite that pact. And this has been the essential problem. We are in an electoral democracy with many of the trappings of a functional electoral democracy, but ensconced within institutions and practices created for an authoritarian system.
We had a question here from Dolia, and then Pat, and I think that will round us off here today.
Well, I have a couple of quick questions. I'd like to go back to what your opening remarks on Pascual, because many people were expecting a different reaction by the US government. As you know, President Calderón was here and he personally asked Obama, a totally unprecedented situation, to get rid of Pascual, or that he didn't like Pascual, or whatever words he used. And the New York Times reported that the answer was no, he's our man and he's staying. But a few days later, less than 10 days, Pascual resigns. He wasn't fired. He resigned because he just couldn't take it. We were expecting some sort of reciprocity, maybe freezing a little bit the activities of our own ambassador here, or a stronger statement from the State Department or even the White House, but there was nothing, absolutely nothing. A few days later, we saw Correa, the president of Ecuador, doing the same thing to the US ambassador. And their reaction was immediately. They declared non grata the Ecuadorian ambassador here in Washington, and he had to go back. It was also around the WikiLeaks. Why the double standard?
Right. When you said Pascual resigned because he couldn't take it, I don't agree with that statement. I think, and I have not talked to Ambassador Pascual since he resigned, so all of this is mere speculation on my part. I think Carlos Pascual resigned because Calderón made his situation in Mexico untenable. From the moment that Felipe Calderón, in both interviews, said that that Pascual was ignorant, that he was ill-informed, that he had wounded the military's pride, et cetera, et cetera. He sent a powerful message to every member of the Mexican bureaucracy, which is, do not speak to this man ever again, which is not a message that other presidents sent to their bureaucracies after WikiLeaks, which in many ways were much more damaging. I mean, what WikiLeaks revealed about the assessments of Angela Merkel or of Cristina Kirchner. So I think Pascual resigned because he realized that he was not going to have the ear, the trust, the necessary interaction that he needed to do his job effectively because Calderón had sent a specific message out, basically declaring him persona non grata. And if you look at Hillary Clinton's comments, I think she says 2 or 3 times when she announces Pascual's resignation that she does so with great, I don't know if she uses the word sorrow, but she clearly, I mean, the mere fact that she came out and announced his resignation when she was off in London and the negotiations over Libya were taking place, that in and of itself, I think, is unprecedented. Now, why the different reaction to Correa? Well, because this was starting to set a precedent. I think you could accept it perhaps in the case of Mexico. And by the way, I would say that there was a reaction. Perhaps the US didn't, no one here actually saw it. But shortly after Pascual resigned, President Obama gave an interview to CNN in which he said that he believed President Calderón was frustrated because he was not winning the war against the drug cartels, or something along those lines, which was, tantamount to, very courteous, but it was going against the official line of Calderón's success. So anyway, I think that was somewhat of a reaction, but I think that in the case of Mexico, first of all, the US didn't know exactly what to do because of the unprecedented nature of the resignation. And when it happened in Ecuador, I think that then the reaction was either we stop this now with a strong gesture on our part, or this is going to start to happen in many other countries. So we better escalate the costs of the decision, something that didn't occur in Mexico's case. And then I mean, I'm just speculating here. I also think that the nature of the relationship is very different. I mean, Mexico, vis-a-vis Ecuador, even though Mexico doesn't have a place of primacy in US foreign policy, I think heightening conflict between the two countries, that one of which is part of NAFTA, was not a decision that the American establishment was willing to make at this time.
Pat, you have the final question. Sorry.
Patricia Fagan, U.S. Institute for Peace. I hope I'm not grasping at straws here, but this discussion has been around the dilemma of, the one hand, what we could see, the seemingly collapse of a state that's a monopolistic authoritarian state from which all power emanates, leaving a situation of local disasters on the one hand, and a dichotomy between the state here and the Mexican citizen, the orange, as you call it, on the other. I want to ask you about subnational institutions at the state level, at the non-state level, inside the party structure, outside the party structure. Are there any initiatives or promising developments that don't take place from the state level that may be leading somewhere? Thank you.
Right. what happened is that during our transition, so many efforts were made to contain the imperial presidency and to contain the arbitrary nature of central federal executive power, that power was wrenched away from the president. So we witnessed a massive redistribution of power in Mexico. Some of it good, because it went to the media, it went to civil society, it went to human rights defenders, it went to the obvious beneficiaries of democracy. But some of that decentralization and dispersion did not have beneficial consequences. Decentralization became, in Mexico over the past 11 years, a double-edged sword, because you ended up empowering, people like me and Mario Marin and Ulises Ruiz and Emilio Azcárraga. In other words, you ended up giving power to state governors, to monopolists, to poderes fácticos, and to drug traffickers who filled the political void left by a presidency that had been in many ways rendered powerless. I think when I was here 2 years ago, I talked about Felipe Calderón being a Mexican Gulliver, being all tied up by the vested interests of Mexico. So what happened is that you saw a country that began to resemble what Wayne Cornelius calls a Swiss cheese. Imagine a country that has holes in it that are authoritarian archipelagos. You gave power and resources to local caciques who began to govern their states as they wanted to. We saw it in the case of Puebla, we saw it in the case of Oaxaca, we've seen it in the case of Coahuila, etc. So you saw the emergence of, to use your term, subnational regimes that went very much against the national trend towards democratization, openness, transparency. And I'd say that those two trends coexist in an uneasy fashion in Mexico today. You get people pushing for greater accountability. For example, the Mexico Competitiveness Institute that is publishing for the first time, transparency indicators, grading states and municipalities on the basis of their openness and transparency. The state of Mexico, by the way, is in last place. Last place of the transparency index created by the IMCO. And you see all sorts of NGOs emerging and trying to gain space for themselves in this more open context. But then you go to places like Coahuila, or you go to places like Puebla, or you go to, until recently, places like Oaxaca, and it was like going to a fiefdom where time had not passed, where the media was controlled by the government and his family, where contracts were given out on the basis of patronage, where local transparency institutes had been eviscerated, where local electoral institutes were completely under the thumb of the governor. And I think that characterizes Mexico today. It's a place, Aguilar Camín refers to it as a place of ashes and seeds, where the remnants of the old regime still persist and are being empowered by the current context, including the fact that you still have this pacto federal, wherein the state, the federal government basically doles out money to state governors with zero accountability. So you end up propping up people like Mario Marin or others. At the same time, democracy is creating contexts of greater opening and challenges to state authority, but I'd say in a very incipient fashion.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. Thank you, Denise.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael Shifter, for your inarticulate commentary. No, sorry. Just a quick announcement. Our next big activity here will be on April 27th. We'll have a conference on Pillar 4 of the Mérida Initiative, the aspect of it that deals with social investment and building resilient communities. There's an announcement on the table. Thank you all for coming, and thanks for those of you who are on the internet.
Great to see you.
Good luck,
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
So have a good trip.
Yeah, thanks.
And we
Okay,
will
we'll be in touch. Good. Thank you. Hello, sir. How are you?
Thanks, Denise. Appreciate it. Brilliant as always. You know Howard?
Denise.
Hi, Pat. Oh. I can't remember what it was even. It was something like $20 or $25. Sure. $20. Fair enough.
So there we are, everything that we talked about
Huh? Yeah.
is pretty much, it's just